They called me a freeloader at their staged family meeting, tossing legal papers across the table. My father ordered me to surrender my inherited home, mocking that I couldn't even afford a decent ride away. A few minutes later, a black BMW arrived. The man stepping out wasn't a driver. He carried the exact files needed to prove the daughter they deemed useless was the only one who knew they had already lost absolutely everything. My name is Genevieve Rice. I am 36 years old, and I should have known better than to drive all the way to Maple Glen, Pennsylvania, on a Tuesday evening. The text message from my mother had arrived at 3 in the afternoon, reading simply that there was an urgent family meeting and my presence was absolutely mandatory. In my naive attempt to be a dutiful daughter, my mind immediately raced to the worst-case scenarios. I thought perhaps my father's heart condition had worsened, or maybe they needed help financing the extensive roof repairs before the bitter East Coast winter set in. Despite the heavy knot of dread tightening in my stomach, I grabbed my keys and made the 45-minute drive from the city. I watched the familiar scenery of the affluent suburbs roll by, the pristine lawns and grand colonial houses looking entirely normal. Yet I could not shake the sinking feeling that told me I was walking straight into a meticulously planned trap. The moment I stepped through the heavy oak front door and into the formal dining room, the suffocating atmosphere hit me. This was not a gathering to discuss medical news or contractor estimates. The layout of the room had been aggressively arranged to resemble a tribunal. My father sat rigidly at the head of the long mahogany table, positioning himself as the presiding judge and ultimate authority. My mother occupied the chair immediately to his right, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her posture perfectly stiff. Directly across from her sat my younger brother, Wesley, the undeniable golden child of the Rice family, practically glowing with an unearned sense of entitlement. Next to him was his wife, Savannah, who was already swirling a glass of white wine with an expression of barely concealed disdain. In the dead center of the table, sitting directly underneath the harsh glare of the crystal chandelier, was a thick manila folder and a heavy silver fountain pen. As I entered, my mother sniffled, dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue. The tears were perfectly timed, rolling down her cheeks exactly as I pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table. It felt entirely rehearsed, a cheap theatrical production where everyone had spent the entire afternoon memorizing their lines and hitting their marks. I sat down slowly, keeping my coat on, suddenly acutely aware of the coldness radiating from my own flesh and blood. My father did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how my drive was or offer me a glass of water. He simply folded his hands over his chest and stared at me with a gaze so sharp it felt physical. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing loudly in the silent, cavernous room, and began the proceedings. Genevieve, we brought you here because this family is at a critical crossroads, and frankly, we are entirely tired of carrying an ungrateful burden, he said, his voice dropping into that chilling, authoritative register he only used when he wanted to assert absolute dominance. For years, you have selfishly hoarded the townhouse your grandmother left you. You sit on a prime piece of old city real estate while making absolutely zero contributions to the people who raised you and fed you. It is time for you to finally step up and make a sacrifice for the greater good of this family. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his opening statement, Wesley leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the polished wood. He flashed that trademark charismatic smile, the exact smile that had charmed our parents into forgiving every single one of his catastrophic life choices over the past 15 years. He had burned through tens of thousands of dollars on a failed craft brewery and an app startup that never launched, yet he still spoke with the unearned confidence of a titan of industry. Look, Wesley started, using the shortened nickname I absolutely loathed. My new logistics company, Blue Harbor, is on the verge of exploding in the best way possible. We are talking unprecedented, massive growth. I have a lucrative contract lined up with a major retail chain that covers the entire Northeast region, but to lock it in, to secure the transport fleet and the warehouse space, I need a bridge loan. Just a temporary injection of capital for maybe 3 to 6 months. Once the ink is dry on this contract, The monthly revenue will be in the millions. But the bank needs hard collateral right now, and quite frankly, your empty townhouse is just sitting there doing absolutely nothing to generate wealth. Savannah scoffed loudly, ensuring the mocking sound carried clearly across the room. She leaned back, crossing her legs, her designer heels catching the light from the chandelier. She looked me up and down, openly evaluating and dismissing my simple black turtleneck, my unbranded jeans, and the distinct lack of expensive jewelry on my hands. Honestly, Genevieve, that property is entirely wasted on you, Savannah chimed in, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. You sit at home all day doing whatever little remote freelance work you do. You dress like you shop exclusively at discount thrift stores. You drive a car that is at least 10 years old, and you clearly have absolutely no concept of what a real investment looks like in the modern world. Wesley is building a massive empire. He is building a legacy for the Rice name. You holding on to that property out of some misplaced, stubborn sense of nostalgia is not just selfish, it is financially illiterate. My mother let out another strategic, trembling sob, pressing the tissue to her nose. We just want what is best for everyone. Sweetheart, we have given you so much over the past 36 years. Is it so wrong to ask you to help your own brother when he is right on the brink of such incredible, life-changing success? My father abruptly ended the chorus of emotional manipulation by reaching out and pushing the manila folder straight down the center of the table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood, the sound a soft hiss, stopping mere inches from my hands. He picked up the silver fountain pen and placed it deliberately on top of the cardboard cover, pointing the gold nib toward me. Inside that folder is a simple legal agreement, my father instructed, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. It transfers the controlling interest of the townhouse into a family trust, a trust that I will personally manage. We will leverage the property to secure Wesley's commercial loan. Once his business scales up and the profits roll in, the loan will be paid off in full, and the property remains safely in the trust for all of us. It is a foolproof strategy, but it strictly requires your signature tonight. We have a finalized meeting with the regional bank director tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. I did not speak immediately. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as 4 pairs of eyes bore into me, expecting me to crumble exactly as I always had when I was a terrified teenager living under their roof. I slowly reached out and flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. I bypassed the sanitized summary page and went straight to the dense, jargon-filled legal clauses at the back, scanning the paragraphs with practiced efficiency. It took me less than 2 minutes to decipher the actual, horrific mechanics of the document they had placed before me. This was not a temporary leveraging maneuver. It was not a safety net for a bridge loan. The clauses explicitly granted the trustee, my father, the unilateral right to liquidate the asset to cover any and all defaults without ever consulting the original owner. Furthermore, the debt-to-value ratio they were proposing was absolutely catastrophic. They were not just borrowing a small sum against the house, they were fully encumbering it with high-interest commercial debt. If Wesley's phantom logistics empire failed, which his track record guaranteed it inevitably would, the bank would seize the townhouse immediately. The paperwork was specifically and maliciously designed to strip me of all ownership rights the second my pen touched the paper. It was the first, irreversible step to selling off the only piece of true security my grandmother had ever given me. She had left it to me because she recognized their greed, and she wanted me to have a safe harbor. They were trying to burn that harbor to the ground. They had dug a massive financial grave, and they were actively trying to shove me into it simply to cushion their own fall. The sheer, unadulterated betrayal washed over me, a dark wave trying to pull me under. But instead of the hot tears my mother was currently faking, or the panic my father expected, I felt only a cold, crystalline clarity settling deep into my bones. The scared, compliant daughter they thought had walked through the door was completely gone. I closed the folder, carefully aligning the edges of the paper so they were perfectly straight. I picked up the silver fountain pen, feeling its heavy weight, and placed it back down on the table, pushing it exactly 1 inch away from the documents. I raised my head, making direct, unflinching eye contact with my father, then my mother, then Wesley, and finally Savannah. The air in the room seemed to freeze entirely, the temperature dropping as they waited for my submission. I will not be signing anything tonight. Growing up in the manicured cul-de-sacs of our affluent Pennsylvania suburb, the roles were assigned early and permanently. I was the capable one, the quiet daughter who never missed a curfew, never failed a test, and fundamentally required zero parental bandwidth. I was deemed fine, a self-sustaining entity in the background of their lives. Wesley, on the other hand, was the blinding sun around which our entire household orbited. His needs were not just priorities, they were unconditional mandates. I clearly remember the evening I brought home the acceptance letter for a full-ride academic scholarship to a top-tier university. I laid the thick envelope on the kitchen island. My mother glanced at it, offered a brief, tight-lipped nod, and immediately went back to chopping vegetables. My father muttered a rushed acknowledgement without taking his eyes off the evening news. Yet, 2 years later, when Wesley dropped out of his demanding finance program and changed his major for the third consecutive time, this time to a vaguely defined entrepreneurial studies track, they threw a massive catered barbecue in our backyard. They invited over 50 guests to celebrate. My father stood on the stone patio with a craft beer in hand, giving a booming, emotional toast to his son, who was bravely finding his true path. I stood by the hedge, holding a plastic cup of water, completely invisible in my own home. That dynamic only sharpened into something deeply resentful when my grandmother passed away 7 years ago. She was the only person who saw the reality of our family structure. She saw past the loud, performative ambition of my brother and recognized the quiet, steady discipline I had built as a shield. When her will was read, she left her prized possession, a stunning, historic townhouse with exposed brick and wrought iron balconies in the heart of Old City, Philadelphia, solely to me. For my parents, that inheritance was an unforgivable transgression. Up until that exact moment, they had maintained absolute financial and emotional control over the entire family ecosystem. Every dollar, every favor, every asset flowed directly through their hands, allowing them to dictate who was in favor and who was currently in exile. The townhouse was the very first piece of substantial wealth that sat securely outside their jurisdiction. They never voiced their anger out loud, but the bitter resentment hung in the air like thick summer humidity. They hated that I had a sanctuary they could not touch, because I owned that property outright. My living expenses were a fraction of what they could have been. I chose to live simply. I did not care for the exhausting performance of modern American success. I kept my career moves completely private. I did not post motivational quotes on professional networking sites or upload carefully filtered photos of my home office setup. I wore comfortable, unbranded clothing, bought my groceries at the local market, and continued driving the same reliable Japanese sedan that currently had over 120,000 miles on the odometer. To a family obsessed with outward appearances, my modest lifestyle was conclusive proof of my utter mediocrity. They assumed my remote work was low-paying, trivial freelance gigging. They looked at my quiet life and saw a pathetic, lazy stagnation. Wesley was the exact opposite, a walking billboard for the illusion of wealth. He spoke exclusively in the frantic, hollow buzzwords of a self-proclaimed business mogul. He loved to stand in the center of a room, wearing a tailored navy suit he could not afford, aggressively pitching the concept of his impending transport empire. He curated a digital life that constantly screamed prosperity. There were always photos of him leaning casually against luxury cars he had only rented for a 48-hour weekend, or clinking expensive drinks at exclusive networking galas in the city. His wife, Savannah, was the perfect co-star in his daily production of fake success. She treated her social media feeds like the brightly lit runway of a triumphant, high-society marriage. Her followers were treated to a relentless barrage of unboxing videos featuring designer handbags that cost more than 4 months of an average person's rent. She documented their trips to five-star resorts, their VIP access to rooftop parties, and their reservations at restaurants where a single steak cost over $100. My parents were absolutely mesmerized by it. They consumed Wesley and Savannah's curated digital lives like a drug, completely blind to the fact that it was a fragile house of cards built on maxed-out credit limits and desperate posturing. For years, every single time Wesley's chaotic ventures inevitably collapsed and he needed a massive financial bailout, my parents rushed to open their checkbooks. They never called it a rescue. They flatly refused to admit he was failing. Instead, they consistently rebranded his begging as a brilliant opportunity. Handing him $20,000 to cover a payroll shortfall was considered noble. Giving him $50,000 to secure a new, entirely unnecessary office lease was proudly labeled a vital investment in the family's legacy. Meanwhile, any actual milestone I achieved was minimized to the point of complete erasure. If I ever mentioned closing a complex deal or expanding my professional network, they would offer a patronizing smile and quickly change the subject back to Wesley's upcoming amateur golf tournament. For more than 30 years, I had carried that same quiet bitterness inside me. Long before then, I had accepted that I would never be enough for them, no matter how hard I worked or how fiercely independent I became. I survived their neglect by holding tightly to the memory of my grandmother sitting in the sunlit courtyard of that very townhouse. She had held my hands, looked me dead in the eye, and told me, "Do not ever let them teach you to doubt your own worth. They will try to make you feel small so they can feel big. You stand your ground." Sitting in their suffocating dining room tonight, staring at the legal trap they had so carefully laid out over the mahogany table, my grandmother's words rang in my ears with absolute, terrifying clarity. The scattered pieces of the puzzle suddenly slammed together, forming a horrifying picture. This was no longer just the passive, toxic favoritism of my childhood. This was an active, predatory maneuver. The careless spending, the rented sports cars, the designer bags, the failing logistics company, the bill for Wesley's lavish delusion had finally come due. And instead of holding him accountable for his disastrous choices, my parents had frantically looked around for a life raft. They looked past all of his expensive toys, past the hollow facade of his success, and locked their eyes directly on the quiet, unassuming daughter they had spent a lifetime dismissing. They did not see me as a human being. They saw me as an untapped equity line. They truly believed that because they had spent 36 years systematically breaking down my confidence, I would be weak enough to hand over my only safe haven without a single fight. They honestly thought I would sacrifice the very foundation of my independence just to buy Wesley a few more months of pretending to be a millionaire. The absolute audacity of their assumption did not break my heart. It hardened it into solid, unbreakable ice. The familial bond they were currently trying to weaponize against me had been dead for years, and tonight I was finally going to bury it. My father's jaw locked, the muscles ticking violently beneath his skin. The veins on his neck bulged against the stiff collar of his impeccably pressed dress shirt. "If you refuse to pick up that pen," he stated, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register that used to terrify me as a teenager, "you are walking out of this house as an absolute stranger. You are consciously choosing to sever your ties with this family. If you walk away from your brother in his hour of need, we will consider you entirely estranged." My mother gasped right on cue. She clutched her pearl necklace as if I had just leaned across the mahogany table and struck her across the face. "Genevieve, how can you be so incredibly cold and calculated?" she wailed, her pitch grating painfully against my eardrums. "We clothed you. We fed you. We paid for every single piano lesson, every medical bill, every meal you ate for 18 consecutive years under this roof. And now, when your own flesh and blood asks for one minuscule, temporary favor, you just turn your back on us? It is a tiny signature to repay a lifetime of parental sacrifice. You owe us this much." Wesley held up both hands, palms facing outward, playing the role of the exceptionally reasonable peacemaker amidst the emotional chaos. "Mom, Dad, please let me handle this. She just needs to understand the grand vision." He turned his attention to me, leaning in with that practiced, aggressive salesperson posture he loved so much. Generally, you are looking at this like a defensive, small-minded pessimist. You need to look at the massive upside. Blue Harbor is not just moving boxes anymore. We are pivoting to a fully integrated cold chain logistics model. We are talking about state-of-the-art, climate-controlled transit hubs spread across 3 major states. He paused, letting his fabricated brilliance hang in the air, then continued with increasing fervor. I have a proprietary routing application in advanced beta testing right now that will slash our commercial fuel consumption by exactly 22%. And the absolute best part? We have a syndicate of heavy-hitting angel investors ready to close the deal by next week. They are bringing in mid-7 figures. We just need this bridge capital to show substantial liquid assets for the primary fleet lease agreement before Friday afternoon. Once that is done, the equity multiplies. I sat perfectly still in my chair, letting his torrential word salad wash right over me. To our parents, it sounded like the undisputed gospel of a budding billionaire. To someone who actually analyzed and dismantled failing corporate entities for a living, it sounded like a frantic, poorly rehearsed script downloaded from a free entry-level business podcast. A proprietary routing application in beta testing? My brother could not even code a basic text-based landing page, let alone oversee the software architecture for logistical algorithms. Slashing commercial fuel consumption by 22%? That was a statistical absurdity in the current reality of freight transit. His projected margins were pure, unadulterated fantasy. Furthermore, genuine angel investors did not demand emergency bridge loans to secure basic fleet leases. They capitalized the operating company directly if the business model held any actual water. Savannah suddenly slammed the base of her wineglass down onto the table. The sharp clatter echoed violently, shattering Wesley's smooth pitch. "God, you are so deeply dense," she snapped, dropping her faux polite, high society facade entirely. "That old brick box of yours in the city is dead equity. It is just sitting there rotting on a historic street. Wesley needs to cycle capital right now, liquidating that property, or at the very least maxing out its loan-to-value ratio to fund a high-yield enterprise, is the only intelligent move on the board. You are literally choking his potential because you want a free, cozy place to sleep." "We are not even selling it immediately," my father interjected loudly, attempting to regain control of the spiraling narrative. But in his arrogant haste to prove his own financial acumen, he made a catastrophic tactical error. I already spoke at length with the senior vice president of commercial lending at First Regional Fidelity. I ran a preliminary inquiry on the specific parcel. Because the deed is currently unencumbered, they pre-approved a commercial line of credit for up to 80% of the appraised market value. The underwriting department has basically finished processing the initial paperwork. The air vanished from my lungs. It was not from a sense of panic, but from the sheer, breathtaking audacity of his casual confession. A preliminary inquiry, pre-approved commercial credit, formal underwriting. Those highly specific banking processes required detailed tax records, formal property surveys, and sworn applications. They had not called me here tonight to beg for my help. They had not summoned me to present an idea for my consideration. They had called me here to finalize a fraudulent financial transaction they had already actively initiated behind my back. They were exactly halfway through stealing the equity of my home, and they simply needed my physical autograph to make their shady maneuvering legally binding. I looked down at the table and slowly tapped my index finger against the thick manila folder resting an inch from my reach. "Who drafted these specific trust documents?" I asked, keeping my vocal tone entirely devoid of any readable emotion. My father shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed chair, suddenly refusing to meet my direct gaze. He looked at the antique grandfather clock standing in the corner, then out at the dark dining room window. "That is entirely irrelevant to the current discussion," he deflected gruffly. Wesley cleared his throat, puffing out his chest under his tailored suit jacket. "A highly respected legal expert drafted them," he bragged smoothly, unable to resist boasting. a senior corporate attorney who happens to be a very close friend of Savannah's family. He gave us a massive, exclusive discount on his standard retainer just to expedite the trust formation, so we could meet the bank's strict Friday deadline. I nodded slowly, letting the heavy, oppressive silence stretch out and fill the corners of the room. Every single answer they provided only served to confirm the staggering depth of their collective betrayal. They had held clandestine meetings over dinner tables I was never invited to. They had deliberately hired outside legal counsel to navigate the loopholes of my grandmother's will. They had actively engaged a regional bank and misrepresented their authority over an asset they did not legally own. They had spent weeks, possibly even months, meticulously digging a massive financial pit in the dark. They were utterly and completely convinced that on this specific Tuesday night, they could emotionally bully me into jumping inside to serve as their permanent stepping stone. They thought they had successfully backed a timid, clueless, financially illiterate freelancer into an inescapable corner. They looked at my plain clothing and my quiet demeanor and saw nothing but a guaranteed victory. But absolutely nobody in that dining room had the slightest idea that I had not come to Maple Glen empty-handed. "You truly believe you hold some moral high ground over us," my father sneered, his face flushing a deep, mottled crimson in the low light of the chandelier. He leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the polished mahogany. "You are 36 years old, and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. You sit there acting like you are above this family, but look at you. You hide out in that decaying brick box. You wear those pathetic, unbranded clothes, and you cannot even afford a decent car to drive yourself away from the only people who are actively trying to pull you out of your miserable stagnation. You are a complete failure. Genevieve, if you walk out that door tonight without signing, you will be walking out with nothing but the lint in your cheap pockets." Right as he delivered what he genuinely believed was a crushing, devastating blow to my self-esteem, a deep, resonant vibration began to rattle the antique window panes of the dining room. It was not the rattling of an old muffler or a struggling engine. It was the low, guttural, aggressive purr of a massive, finely tuned machine pulling smoothly into the circular driveway just outside. Headlights swept sharply across the sheer curtains, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dining table. Wesley frowned, his practiced, arrogant smile faltering for a fraction of a second as he leaned over to peer through the narrow gap in the drapes. His eyes widened slightly before he quickly masked his surprise with a loud, theatrical scoff. "Oh, this is genuinely hilarious," Wesley chuckled, pointing toward the window with mock enthusiasm. "Are you kidding me right now? A brand new, midnight black BMW flagship sedan? Did you seriously order a premium executive car service just to stage a dramatic exit for us?" Savannah immediately chimed in, her voice dripping with venomous amusement as she adjusted her posture to look out the window as well. "She probably maxed out her only credit card. I bet her card has a $500 limit, and she blew every single penny of it just to rent that thing for exactly 2 hours. It is pathetic. A freelance worker trying to flex on real business owners. You cannot fake real wealth. Sweetheart, the meter is ticking out there while you play pretend." I did not blink. I did not turn my head to look out the glass to confirm the vehicle. I kept my eyes locked entirely onto my father, watching the smug satisfaction slowly drain from his features as the heavy oak front door of the house clicked open. No one had rung the doorbell. No one had knocked. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the foyer, moving steadily and confidently toward the dining room. The man who stepped through the archway was entirely out of place in their suburban, faux colonial sanctuary. He was in his mid-40s, impeccably groomed, and wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit that draped perfectly across his broad shoulders. It was the kind of masterclass tailoring that silently communicated an immense, unquestionable level of power and infinite resources. He held a weathered but exceptionally high-end leather briefcase in his left hand and a thick, rigid document tube in his right. His expression was a portrait of absolute professional indifference. He surveyed the room, his sharp, calculating eyes briefly passing over the weeping mother, the posturing brother, the sneering sister-in-law, and the red-faced patriarch, he did not look intimidated in the slightest. He looked like a seasoned apex predator who had just walked into a cage full of very loud, very oblivious canaries. He was profoundly used to walking into deeply hostile environments and utterly dismantling the people inside them. My father bolted upright, his chair scraping violently against the polished hardwood floor, his face contorted with a volatile mixture of shock and territorial rage. "Excuse me? Who the hell do you think you are?" he barked, pointing a trembling finger at the stranger. "Who let you into my private residence? You are trespassing. Get out of my house this instant before I call the local authorities." My mother gasped, clutching her linen napkin to her chest as if we were under a hostile armed siege. "Wesley, do something," she whimpered, completely dropping her fake manipulative tears from earlier. Wesley puffed out his chest and took a half step forward, trying to project physical intimidation to protect his territory. But he wisely stopped short when the man simply raised one perfectly arched eyebrow at him, silently daring him to close the distance. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly on my lap. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a glacial clarity that cut cleanly through their escalating panic. "You do not need to call the authorities. He is here at my express invitation. This is my legal counsel and my managing director of wealth strategy, Mr. Adrian Cole." For exactly 3 agonizing seconds, the entire dining room fell completely and utterly silent. The sheer absurdity of my statement, contrasting with the reality of my plain black turtleneck and my decades-long status as the family disappointment, hung suspended in the heavy air. And then, the room exploded. Wesley was the first to break, letting out a booming, patronizing roar of laughter. He actually slapped his hand against the mahogany table, leaning back as if I had just delivered the greatest punchline of his life. "You're what?" Wesley wheezed, wiping a tear of genuine mirth from his eye. "Director of Wealth Strategy? Are you absolutely delusional? Since when does a remote tech support worker making maybe $40,000 a year need a wealth strategist? What is he managing for you? Your grocery coupon collection and your checking account overdraft fees?" Savannah let out a high-pitched, grating giggle, covering her mouth with her manicured hand. Oh my God. She actually hired an actor. She went online and hired a cheap local actor to come in here and play a lawyer. This is the saddest, most desperate thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life. Even my father chuckled, a dark, rumbling sound of pure condescension, though his eyes remained nervously fixed on the man in the suit. "Genevieve, enough of this childish charade. Tell your little hired friend to leave right now. Pick up that pen and sign the trust documents like an adult before I lose my temper." I did not bother explaining myself. I did not offer a single word of defense against their mockery. Explanations were for people who desperately needed to be understood, and I was long past caring if these people understood me. I simply turned my head slightly and gave Adrian a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. Adrian did not say a single word. He did not introduce himself, nor did he offer a polite, diplomatic handshake to the man screaming at him. He simply stepped forward, moving with the cold, mechanical efficiency of a man who was getting paid an astronomical hourly rate to execute a very specific, highly destructive demolition. He walked directly to the center of the table, entirely ignoring my father who was still standing defensively. With a deliberate, heavy thud, Adrian placed his bespoke leather briefcase directly on top of the manila folder my father had pushed toward me earlier, effectively pinning their fraudulent trust documents beneath it. He unlatched the heavy brass locks with 2 sharp clicks that sounded exactly like gunshots in the sudden quiet of the room. The laughter died instantly. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted with violent speed. The air grew dense, heavy with the sudden, terrifying realization that the man standing before them was not a cheap actor, and the briefcase he was systematically opening was not a theatrical prop. My family stared at the open leather case, the color slowly draining from their smug faces, completely unaware that the solid ground beneath their feet had just permanently vanished. Adrian's movements were precise, devoid of any wasted energy. From the velvet-lined interior of his briefcase, he withdrew a thick, professionally bound dossier. The cover was a stark, matte black, bearing no insignia other than a crisp white label. He slid it across the polished mahogany, coming to a halt precisely in front of me, completely ignoring the sputtering indignation still radiating from the head of the table. I placed my hand flat against the cool cover. The room was so quiet, I could hear the erratic, shallow breathing of my mother. "I have never had the slightest interest in prying into your personal life. Wesley," I began, my voice steady, carrying easily across the expanse of the dining room. "For years, I let you spin your elaborate tales of corporate conquest. I let you play the triumphant mogul at every family gathering. I truly did not care. However, when the subtle, passive-aggressive comments regarding my property suddenly escalated into a highly coordinated, aggressive campaign to strip me of my only asset, I realized I could no longer afford the luxury of ignorance. I had to verify exactly why my family was suddenly so desperately thirsty for my equity." I flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a masterfully condensed executive summary. "Let us take a very close look at Blue Harbor Route Systems," I announced, reading the name of his supposed empire aloud. The words tasted like ash and cheap perfume. "Your rapidly scaling, revolutionary logistics startup. According to the pitch you delivered less than 30 minutes ago, you are on the precipice of unprecedented regional dominance. The actual, verified financial reality, however, tells a wildly different story." I turned to the first tabbed section, sliding a color-coded forensic accounting spreadsheet toward the center of the table so my father could see the stark red ink bleeding across the columns. "Blue Harbor has operated with a severely negative cash flow for exactly 14 consecutive months," I stated, the unfeeling data acting as my only weapon. "You are bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. You mentioned a massive, lucrative contract with a major retail chain covering the entire Northeast. That is a complete fabrication. What you actually possess is a single, non-binding letter of interest. It is a polite, legally meaningless piece of paper that guarantees absolutely zero volume, zero revenue, and zero commitment. It is not a contract. It is a glorified email printout." Wesley's face drained of its arrogant flush, replaced by a sickening, pale gray. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I did not give him the oxygen. I turned to the next page. "If you are not securing contracts or purchasing actual freight assets, one must ask where the initial seed capital went," I continued, tracing my finger down an itemized ledger of absolute absurdity. "The operational expenditure reports are genuinely fascinating. You have poured tens of thousands of dollars into short-term luxury vehicle rentals. You have expensed extravagant 5-course dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants under the guise of client acquisition, though absolutely no clients were ever acquired. You authorized the purchase of imported, high-end ergonomic office furniture for a headquarters that currently houses a total of 3 part-time administrative assistants. You have consistently booked first-class airfare to Miami and Las Vegas for networking conferences that yielded absolutely no measurable return on investment. You have spent a fortune acting like a wildly successful chief executive officer, but you have invested practically nothing into the actual, physical machinery of a functional transport business." "That is a lie," Wesley exploded, slamming both of his palms down on the table so hard the crystal wine glasses rattled violently. He shot up from his chair, a cornered animal lashing out in pure, unadulterated panic. "You are making all of this up. You hired some shady, bottom-feeding private investigator to smear me. This is illegal. You hacked into my private corporate servers. I will sue you for corporate espionage and massive data theft." He was practically hyperventilating, pointing a trembling finger at Adrian. "You cannot just walk into my parents' house with stolen, fabricated documents and try to ruin my reputation." Adrian did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and met Wesley's frantic gaze with the cold, dead eyes of a seasoned apex predator. "There was absolutely no need for espionage. Mr. Rice, Adrian replied, his tone smooth, measured, and utterly devastating. Your financial incompetence is entirely a matter of public record. A substantial portion of the data presented in this dossier was legally sourced from standard commercial filings, actively published corporate debt registries, and open civil litigation dockets. The remaining internal vouchers and operational ledgers were willingly and legally provided by your former co-founder, who recently exited the enterprise and is currently preparing to file a massive civil suit against you for gross fiduciary negligence. Wesley's knees seemed to buckle slightly at the mention of his former partner. He sank back down into his chair, his jaw hanging completely slack. I did not stop. The momentum was entirely mine now, and I intended to crush every last delusion functioning in this room. I turned to the third tab in the binder, the pages heavy with impending ruin. It gets much worse, I said, my voice dropping an octave, forcing them to lean in and listen to the sound of their own destruction. You are currently severely past due on the lease agreements for 2 separate outsourced commercial warehouses. You have completely ignored 3 consecutive demand letters from a heavy-duty truck maintenance crew, and they are officially filing a mechanic's lien against your microscopic, deteriorating fleet tomorrow morning. Furthermore, the specialized cold storage equipment you claimed was proprietary? It is entirely leased, and the holding company that owns those units has already initiated the formal legal process for aggressive, immediate repossession due to 4 months of absolute non-payment. Savannah, whose entire social identity was inexplicably tied to the sinking ship I was currently exposing, let out a desperate, shrill laugh. She gripped the edges of the table, her knuckles turning bone-white as she tried to reconstruct the shattered illusion. You have absolutely no idea how modern business works, Genevieve, Savannah spat, though her voice shook violently with repressed terror. Every single major startup has to burn through massive amounts of cash before they become profitable. It is called scaling. You have to spend money to make money. You have to project success to attract real wealth. Huge tech founders burned money for years. Wesley is just navigating the volatile expansion phase. I slowly closed the black folder. The heavy thud of the cardboard cover finalized the end of the debate. I looked past Savannah's panicked, heavily contoured face and locked eyes directly with my brother. All the charismatic bluster, all the tailor-made confidence, had completely evaporated. He looked exactly like the terrified, irresponsible little boy who used to break expensive things and beg our parents to hide the evidence. You are not in an expansion phase, Wesley, I said, delivering the absolute, unvarnished truth with surgical precision. You do not need capital to expand a booming empire. You need money to stop your fraudulent company from completely and totally collapsing into bankruptcy in exactly 3 weeks. The silence that followed was entirely different from the shocked pauses earlier in the evening. This was the deafening, suffocating silence of a massive, rotted structure finally giving way and crashing to the earth. I looked to the head of the table, my father. The man who had confidently ordered me to sign away my future just 30 minutes ago was frozen in his high-backed chair. His mouth was slightly open, his face completely drained of its angry, self-righteous color. Beside him, my mother had stopped her theatrical weeping entirely. She stared at Wesley, her eyes impossibly wide, darting frantically back and forth between her golden child and the damning black dossier sitting in the center of the table. For the very first time in my entire life, I saw the impenetrable armor of their parental delusion crack wide open. The absolute, undeniable terror of total financial ruin had finally breached the walls of their comfortable suburban dining room, and they were staring right at the bottom of the black hole they had almost blindly jumped into. I did not allow the suffocating silence to linger long enough for any of them to catch their breath. The utter destruction of my brother's fictitious corporate empire was merely the opening act of this evening. I reached across the polished mahogany and pushed the black binder containing Wesley's financial ruin slightly to the left. I turned my head and gave Adrian another subtle, silent nod. Adrian moved with the same terrifying, unhurried precision as before. He reached into his bespoke leather case and smoothly extracted a second, noticeably slimmer file. This one was bound in a muted, dark blue cover. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he stepped forward and placed it squarely on the table directly in front of my father. "Did you honestly believe I would stop at investigating the logistics company?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level, a stark contrast to the heavy, panicked breathing echoing around the room. "If you are going to summon me to a staged tribunal and aggressively demand the title to my home to cover a debt, it is only logical that I understand the entire financial ecosystem of the people making that demand." I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. "Let us talk about your personal finances. 6 months ago, Father, you quietly initiated a massive withdrawal from the home equity line of credit attached to this very house. You pulled out exactly $150,000. You did not use that money for the roof repairs you complained about all autumn, nor did you use it to upgrade your medical insurance. You bypassed your joint savings entirely and wired those funds directly into the rapidly depleting operating account of Blue Harbor Route Systems." My father recoiled as if the blue folder on the table had suddenly caught fire. The last remaining traces of his patriarchal authority vanished, replaced by the sheer, naked panic of a man who realized his deepest, most shameful secret had just been laid bare in bright light. I did not stop. I slowly turned my gaze to my mother, who was currently gripping the edges of her chair with white knuckles. "And you, Mother," I continued, letting a sharp edge of disgust bleed into my tone. "You played the role of the helpless, worried matriarch so perfectly tonight. You cried on cue. You talked about family sacrifice. But exactly 4 months ago, you drove to a commercial lending office 2 towns over and legally bound yourself as the primary co-signer on a high-yield heavy equipment lease for your beloved son. A lease that, as we established mere minutes ago, is currently in active default and headed for immediate repossession." My mother let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She turned completely translucent, her eyes darting frantically toward my father, terrified of his reaction. But my father was entirely too consumed by his own exposure to care about hers. He slammed his fist down onto the table, a desperate, hollow sound. "How dare you!" he bellowed, his voice cracking violently under the strain of his fading dominance. "You have absolutely no right to rummage through the private, confidential financial decisions of your own parents. We are the heads of this family. What we choose to do with our personal assets is absolutely none of your business. You are stepping completely out of line. It became my business the exact second you tried to steal my house to cover your gambling losses," I fired back, my voice slicing through his outrage like a heavy steel blade. "My client has not overstepped any legal boundaries," Adrian interjected smoothly, his calm baritone instantly commanding the chaotic room. He reached out and tapped a specific document protruding from the blue folder. "In fact, your own actions invited this scrutiny. We obtained this specific banking inquiry log directly from First Regional Fidelity. It clearly documents that 3 weeks ago, you actively utilized your lingering, outdated status as the former executor of the grandmother's estate to fraudulently represent yourself to their underwriting department. You explicitly claimed you possessed the legal authority to mortgage the Old City property. You initiated a commercial transaction using an asset you do not own. That is not a private financial decision. That is a textbook definition of preliminary mortgage fraud." My father collapsed back into his chair, the fight completely draining out of his posture. He looked small, old, and profoundly defeated. The psychological puzzle of my family finally clicked into perfect, horrifying clarity. For years, I had assumed they were simply blind victims of Wesley's charismatic manipulation. I thought they loved him so much they simply could not see his failures. But staring at the undeniable paper trail, the truth was far more sinister. "You were not manipulated by him at all," I said, the realization leaving a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. "That is the most pathetic part of this entire charade. You are not innocent victims. You actively participated. You saw his bank statements. You knew his company was bleeding cash. But you willfully ignored the mathematical reality because you were completely intoxicated by the fantasy he was selling. My mother finally broke. It was not the calculated, theatrical weeping from the beginning of the evening. It was an ugly, guttural sob of absolute humiliation. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "We just wanted us to win for once," she wailed, the raw, unfiltered truth tearing its way out of her throat. "We just wanted to be like the people Savannah posts about." Every single week at the country club, I have to sit there and listen to those women brag about their children's massive estates and their corporate promotions. We wanted to be truly wealthy. We wanted to secure our place in that society. Wesley promised us that this final cash injection would push the company public. He promised we would all be millionaires by next spring. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, vast emptiness. "And that is the bitterest pill of all," I told her, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "For over 3 decades, you used my quiet, simple life as a measuring stick to make Wesley look like a towering success. I was your designated baseline of failure. I was the disappointment you whispered about to your friends, so his fake achievements would shine brighter. But the absolute second your golden idol started to crack, the moment you needed real, tangible equity to save yourselves from total public humiliation, you suddenly remembered my name. You brought me here to slaughter my future, so you could keep playing pretend." The suffocating tension in the room finally reached its breaking point, but it did not snap toward me. It snapped inward. The united front that had tried to bully me into submission violently collapsed, turning into a rabid, dog-eat-dog frenzy. Wesley, realizing his parents could no longer serve as his financial or emotional human shields, instantly turned on the person sitting next to him. He spun toward Savannah, his face twisted in pure, venomous blame. "This is your fault," Wesley screamed, jabbing a finger inches from his wife's face. "You demanded the luxury vacations. You threw absolute temper tantrums if we did not lease the newest imported sports utility vehicles every single year. You bled my operating budget dry just so you could show off designer bags to your superficial, pathetic followers." Savannah leaped to her feet, her chair crashing backward onto the floor. She did not back down. She stepped right into his space, her eyes blazing with equal fury. "Do not you dare try to put this failure on me, you pathetic fraud!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the dining room walls. "Your own parents demanded we look the part. Every single time we came over for Sunday dinner, your father asked why you were not driving a better car yet. Your mother constantly compared my jewelry to the diamonds her friends bought for their daughters. You were all so deeply obsessed with looking like a wealthy dynasty that you forced us to fake it. I just played the role your psychotic family demanded." My mother gasped in horror at the accusation, while my father weakly commanded them both to shut up. The formal dining room devolved into a vicious, ugly screaming match. Mother crying hysterically, father shouting useless orders, Wesley and Savannah tearing each other apart with years of repressed resentment. I sat perfectly still in my chair, watching the fire burn through the absolute center of my family. They were cannibalizing themselves, destroying their own fragile ecosystem in a desperate bid to shift the blame for their collective ruin. They thought the worst was over. They thought this was the rock bottom of the evening. They had absolutely no idea that I had not even delivered the fatal blow yet. Wesley was panting, his face a grotesque mask of sweaty desperation. He could not win against his wife's screeching accusations, nor could he magically undo the catastrophic financial ruin sitting in the black binder between us. So, lacking any other viable defense mechanism, he instinctively turned his venom back toward the safest target he had known his entire life. "You think you are so incredibly brilliant," Wesley spat, his voice cracking with a pathetic mixture of blind rage and profound, inescapable humiliation. He pointed a trembling finger across the table at me. "You sit there silently judging me, acting like you understand the complex mechanics of corporate finance. You're nothing but some woman fixing computers from home. You fix broken internet routers for confused senior citizens. You are just completely jealous that I actually had the guts to build something massive, while you rot in that old brick house hiding from the real world." I let his insult hang in the stagnant, suffocating air of the formal dining room. I looked at his rumpled, bespoke suit, the expensive fabric suddenly looking incredibly cheap against the stark backdrop of his impending bankruptcy. "I think we have entertained this particular familial fantasy long enough," I said quietly. The volume of my voice was extremely low, but the absolute, unyielding authority behind it acted like a physical weight, pressing down on the room and silencing his frantic breathing. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my unbranded, simple black turtleneck. "I do not provide freelance technical support, Wesley," I stated, locking my eyes with his terrified stare. "I never have. I actively allowed you and our parents to believe that specific narrative because it was the most highly efficient way to ensure you would all leave me entirely alone. I knew with absolute certainty that the exact second any of you realized I possessed significant liquid capital, you would descend upon me like starving animals. You would have ruthlessly demanded I finance every single one of your catastrophic, ego-driven ventures under the suffocating, manipulative guise of family duty." I turned my gaze slowly toward the head of the table. My father was glaring up at me, his deep-seated confusion warring aggressively with his lingering, desperate arrogance. "My actual professional title," I continued, ensuring every single word landed with the heavy, undeniable force of a judge delivering a final, unappealable verdict, "is the founder and the majority shareholder of Northren Risk and Recovery. We are a private corporate entity that specializes in aggressive corporate asset restructuring, forensic commercial fraud investigation, and the highly targeted acquisition of distressed institutional debt." I did not need to raise my voice. The name of my firm dropped into the dead center of the mahogany dining table like a live explosive device. Adrian, moving with his signature flawless timing, reached into his bespoke leather briefcase one final time. He withdrew a pristine, cream-colored dossier and laid it open directly beside the documents detailing Wesley's total ruin. Inside were the state-certified articles of incorporation, the legally verified corporate ownership ledgers, and a heavily summarized executive portfolio. They were thoroughly redacted to ensure strict client privacy, but the sheer volume of capital represented on those thick pages was mathematically staggering. The numbers, printed in stark black ink, represented tens of millions of dollars in actively managed assets and highly leveraged commercial buyouts. My father leaned forward mechanically, his eyes scanning the embossed corporate letterhead, the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw visibly trembled. "Northren," my father whispered, the words scraping painfully against his dry throat. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying, paradigm-shattering realization. "I read an extensive feature about Northren in the Regional Business Journal just last month. They ruthlessly orchestrated the hostile takeover of that massive commercial shipping conglomerate down by the naval yard. They completely liquidated the executive board in 48 hours. He swallowed hard, completely and utterly unable to reconcile the image of the ruthless, apex predator corporate entity he had read about with the quiet, compliant daughter he had spent over 3 decades systematically ignoring. That is a private holding company with 9 figures in operational capital. That is absolutely not you. That cannot possibly be you." Adrian tapped the legally certified ownership ledger with one perfectly manicured finger. "I assure you, Chae, the woman standing at the opposite end of your table is the sole architect and the absolute governing authority of that institution. She built it entirely from the ground up over the last 12 years, while you were entirely preoccupied with funding your son's recreational, fictional lifestyle." The psychological whiplash inside the dining room was violent. The entire power structure of the family, a rigid hierarchy that had remained absolute and unquestioned since my early childhood, instantly collapsed into fine dust. My mother, who less than 5 minutes ago was sobbing hysterically over the tragic loss of her fabricated country club status, experienced a sudden, chilling behavioral transformation. The raw, ugly panic vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a terrifyingly smooth, practiced mask of maternal warmth. She physically turned her body completely away from Wesley, abandoning her golden child the exact moment his financial utility permanently expired. "Oh, my darling," my mother cooed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, entirely artificial affection that made my stomach violently turn. She took a tentative step toward my end of the table, clasping her hands together against her chest in a grotesque display of theatrical joy. "Why on earth did you keep such a magnificent, incredible achievement a secret from your own mother? We would have been so incredibly proud of you. We could have celebrated your massive success together. We just did not know. Sweetheart, if we had known you were doing so wonderfully, we never would have asked you to leverage the townhouse. You must understand, we were just trying to protect the family from a temporary hardship." It was the most revolting display of opportunistic loyalty I had ever witnessed in my entire life. She was desperately attempting to rewrite 36 years of emotional neglect and psychological abuse in exactly 5 seconds simply because she smelled the heavy, metallic scent of actual, generational wealth. Before I could even vocalize my profound disgust at her pivot, Savannah let out a sharp, breathless sound of pure, unadulterated envy. She was staring at me from across the table, her eyes frantically raking over my simple clothing, my unstyled hair, and the distinct lack of any visible luxury brands on my person. Her mind, deeply infected by the superficial disease of social media optics, simply could not process the crushing reality standing before her. "No," Savannah hissed, gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her manicured acrylic nails looked ready to violently snap. "I refuse to believe this insane charade. You do not dress like someone who owns a private equity firm. You drive a beat-up sedan that is over a decade old. You do not even carry a designer handbag to family dinners. People with that kind of money do not live like invisible ghosts. You are lying. You paid this man to forge these papers just to humiliate us because you have always been bitterly jealous of my lifestyle." I looked down at my sister-in-law, a remarkably hollow woman who had built her entire existence on a fragile foundation of maxed-out credit cards and desperate, transparent posturing. I felt absolutely no need to defend my quiet lifestyle to someone completely drowning in her own toxic illusions. "True wealth does not need to scream for attention, Savannah," I replied, my tone completely devoid of any sympathy or anger. Only deeply desperate people feel the overwhelming need to loudly broadcast their perceived financial status to complete strangers on the internet. I do not wear my net worth on my wrist because I absolutely do not require the validation of people I fundamentally do not respect. I let my cold gaze sweep across the entire room, taking in the 4 broken, terrified individuals who had confidently planned to ruin my life just 1 hour ago. "I did not bring my legal counsel here tonight to arrogantly brag about my corporate portfolio," I stated, projecting an aura of absolute, impenetrable ice. "I genuinely do not care if you believe the certified documents resting on this table. I do not care if you comprehend my business model. I am not standing here to seek your approval, your newly discovered fake affection, or your pathetic, conditional apologies." I placed both of my hands flat on the polished wood of the table, leaning forward just enough to ensure my physical presence entirely dominated the space. "I came here tonight for 2 very specific reasons," I continued, my voice echoing sharply off the high ceiling. "First, to permanently protect the only piece of property my grandmother left me from your predatory greed. And second, to establish an absolute, unbreakable boundary. You will never again view me as your financial safety net. You will never view me as your subordinate. And you will never, under any circumstances, attempt to manipulate my life or my assets again." The dynamic in the room had completely and irreversibly shifted. I was no longer the weak, easily bullied scapegoat they could casually sacrifice to appease their own monumental failures. But as I looked into my father's calculating, shifting eyes and saw the desperate, trapped animal panic still simmering in Wesley's rigid posture, I realized something far more dangerous. They no longer looked at me with passive dismissal. They looked at me with absolute, paralyzing fear. And for a family entirely driven by pride, entitlement, and the desperate, gnawing need to survive their own catastrophic mistakes, that newly born fear did not make them compliant or remorseful. It made them wildly, unpredictably dangerous. They were backed into a dark corner of their own making, the walls closing in rapidly, and they knew I was the only person in the world holding the key to the exit. My father was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of absolute control. Even as the undeniable proof of my corporate authority and his son's financial ruin sat heavily on the mahogany table, his deeply ingrained arrogance refused to simply roll over and die. He physically braced himself, planting his hands flat against the edge of the table, and slowly pushed himself back up into a standing position. His breathing was ragged, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat, but his eyes darted frantically around the room, desperately searching for one final, hidden weapon to regain his dominance. He violently adjusted his silk tie, clearing his throat to forcibly lower his vocal register back to its usual booming authoritarian tone. "You can flash all the fancy corporate portfolios you want," my father growled, pointing a rigid finger at me. "You can buy a sleek firm and play the role of a ruthless executive downtown, but you are completely forgetting one extremely crucial legal detail about this family. The estate management process following your grandmother's death was incredibly complex. The title transfer of that property in the city was never entirely, perfectly severed from my overarching administrative authority as the primary executor. There are residual administrative holds and bureaucratic loopholes that still bear my legal signature." He leaned forward, his voice dripping with a toxic mixture of desperation and vindictive spite. "I am still the patriarch of this family. We are currently facing a massive, catastrophic financial crisis, and we absolutely need capital to save each other from total ruin. Your petty desire for independence does not supersede the survival of this family unit. Tomorrow morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, I am walking straight into that regional bank. I will utilize every single ounce of my residual executor influence to finalize that commercial line of credit. I will legally encumber that townhouse, force a mandatory liquidation sale, and extract the equity we need. You might have money now, but I still have the legal leverage to force your hand on that specific property." He stood tall, chest puffed out, genuinely believing he had found the ultimate loophole to trap me. He thought he could still bully his way into my safe harbor through sheer bureaucratic force. I did not interrupt his desperate, breathless rant. I let him exhaust his final reserves of false authority, watching him meticulously rebuild his fragile house of cards. When he finally finished, the dining room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. My mother looked at him with a sudden, foolish glimmer of hope, while Wesley practically vibrated with renewed, malicious energy. I looked at my father for a very long, unblinking moment. The corners of my mouth did not twitch. My posture remained entirely relaxed. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper yet cutting through the room like a razor blade, "that your specific financial inquiry and the temporary bridge loan you secured against it are still sitting in the vaults of that original bank?" My father frowned, the triumphant sneer freezing on his face. His eyes narrowed in profound confusion. "What are you talking about? Of course it is. I initiated the preliminary underwriting process just 2 weeks ago." I did not answer him directly. Instead, I gave Adrian the final signal of the evening. Adrian stepped forward, his expression completely devoid of mercy. He reached into the very bottom of his bespoke leather case and withdrew a single, heavy document folder. It was not bound in standard plastic or cardboard. It was a thick, legal-sized envelope, sealed with a formal notary stamp. He pulled the documents free and placed them directly in the center of the table. The heavy, premium parchment paper landed with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to echo in the hollow space of the room. It was a fully executed, aggressively notarized contract of assignment and debt transfer. When my automated property monitoring service flagged an unauthorized, highly irregular credit inquiry attached to the deed of my townhouse, I explained, speaking slowly to ensure they comprehended every single syllable of their impending doom. I did not just sit at home and wonder what was happening, and I certainly did not wait for you to summon me to this ridiculous, staged tribunal to find out. I stood up, walking slowly around the edge of the long table, the sound of my footsteps measuring the final seconds of their delusion. I traced the inquiry, I continued. I discovered that you did not just talk to the primary regional bank. You realized the underwriting process there would take too long to save Wesley's collapsing company. So, you used your outdated, ambiguous executor credentials to secure a rapid, high-interest mezzanine loan from a secondary, predatory lending institution. You used the pending application on my house as informal collateral, promising them you would have my signature to formalize the mortgage by the end of this week. My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollowed-out ghost. You borrowed a substantial amount of temporary capital, I said, stopping a few feet away from him. But here's the fascinating reality of the modern financial sector. Secondary lenders are extremely eager to offload high-risk, hastily approved promissory notes for immediate liquidity. Through the Distressed Asset Acquisition Fund at North Ren, my firm aggressively approached that specific secondary lender exactly 4 days ago. I pointed to the heavy parchment documents resting on the table. We bought your paper, I stated, delivering the final, crushing blow with absolute, terrifying calm. We purchased the exact debt you covertly attached to my property, because you utilized the property file in a highly ambiguous, potentially fraudulent manner during your capital acquisition process. The primary payment obligation, the extreme late penalties, and the absolute legal leverage over that loan have entirely transferred to the new buyer. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a sheer drop off a massive cliff. And that buyer, I concluded, locking eyes with the man who had tormented me my entire life, is the private corporation over which I hold absolute unilateral control. You do not owe a faceless bank anymore. Father, you owe me. The sheer, monumental weight of the financial checkmate crashed down on his shoulders. He staggered backward, his knees violently buckling. He caught himself on the back of his chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the notarized debt transfer. The final move he had meant to use to force my compliance had suddenly turned against him, transforming in an instant into a crushing, inescapable trap of his own making. If he defaulted, and given the family's complete lack of actual liquid assets, a default was mathematically guaranteed, my firm possessed the legal right to aggressively pursue his primary residence, his retirement accounts, and every single asset tied to his personal guarantee. Wesley snapped. The realization that his bailout money was permanently gone, and that the sister he deeply despised now held the ultimate power to destroy their parents, shattered his fragile psyche entirely. He kicked his heavy wooden dining chair backward so violently it crashed against the antique credenza, shattering a decorative porcelain vase. "This is completely insane," Wesley screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged shriek. He lunged toward the table, slamming his fists wildly against the wood. "I demand to see those papers right now. I am calling my legal team. I am calling the state financial regulators. You cannot just secretly buy our debt and hold us hostage. This is a premeditated, psychotic conspiracy. This is a malicious, calculated revenge plot to destroy your own blood relatives." He paced frantically back and forth, tearing at his hair, spitting his furious accusations across the room while Savannah cowered silently in her corner, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the financial violence unfolding before her. I looked at my younger brother, watching him completely unravel under the pressure of his own catastrophic failures. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt only the clean, sharp satisfaction of a perfectly executed surgical extraction. "No," I replied, my voice slicing through his hysterical screaming with the temperature of liquid nitrogen. "This is absolutely not a revenge plot. This is simply the inevitable consequence of you assuming I would forever be the person who sits entirely still while being taken for absolutely everything." The violent energy that had propelled Wesley's tantrum evaporated, leaving behind a suffocating, pathetic vacuum. My mother was the very first to completely crumble under the crushing weight of their new reality. The theatrical, delicate sniffling she had utilized at the beginning of the evening was entirely gone. It was replaced by raw, ugly, hyperventilating sobs. She collapsed forward, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the sheer terror of impending poverty. "Genevieve, please," my mother gasped, lifting her tear-streaked face to look at me with wide, pleading eyes. "You cannot do this. You cannot turn this into a horrific legal battlefield. We are still a family. Underneath all of this terrible confusion, we are your blood. Please, I am begging you, do not let those corporate lawyers tear us apart over money." My father, witnessing the complete collapse of his wife, abandoned his aggressive posture entirely. The tyrannical patriarch who had ordered me to sign away my home was instantly replaced by a hollow, trembling old man. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, knuckles white, and deliberately softened his voice, attempting to inject a pathetic layer of paternal warmth into his absolute defeat. "Your mother is right," my father reasoned, his voice cracking with dry panic. "I made a massive miscalculation. I admit it. I overstepped. But you have to understand my intentions. Genevieve, everything I did, even the things that were legally ambiguous, I did because I was desperately trying to secure a future for this entire family. I was trying to build a lasting legacy. I made a terrible mistake in my methods, but my heart was focused on protecting all of us. You cannot punish me for trying to save my children." Wesley, realizing that his parents were completely powerless to shield him, executed the most nauseating pivot of the entire night. The arrogant chief executive persona vanished. He stumbled around the edge of the table, closing the distance between us, his hands clasped together in front of his chest like a desperate penitent. "General, listen to me, please," Wesley pleaded, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "I can fix this. I swear to you on my life, I can turn Blue Harbor around. If you just inject enough capital to clear those immediate debts and get the fleet back on the road, I will restructure everything. I will pay you back every single cent with maximum interest. I will sell the leased cars tomorrow morning. I will cancel the country club memberships. I will cut every single luxury expense immediately. Just save the company this one time. You are my big sister. Please, just give me one final chance to prove I can do this." Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his request, Savannah stepped forward. Her heavy makeup was slightly smeared, her designer dress looking entirely out of place in a room that suddenly felt like a sinking ship. In a breathtaking display of complete delusion, she attempted to negotiate with the only currency she truly valued. "Genevieve, if you do this for us," Savannah offered, her tone entirely serious. "If you use your firm to bail Wesley out and clear your father's debt, things will be completely different from now on. We will include you in everything. We will invite you to all the dinners, the galas, the vacations. We will genuinely respect you. You will finally be treated like a true equal in this family." The absolute absurdity of her proposition hung in the quiet room for a fraction of a second before a sound escaped my throat. It was not a chuckle of amusement. It was a cold, sharp, abrasive laugh that cut through their groveling like a jagged piece of glass. My laughter echoed against the high ceiling, chilling the room. They all froze, staring at me with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. "Respect me more?" I repeated, letting the words roll over my tongue, tasting the profound sickness of their worldview. I looked directly into Savannah's heavily contoured face, then shifted my gaze to my brother, my mother, and finally, my father. That single sentence completely exposes the absolute core of your collective disease. You have never, not for a single day in 36 years, viewed me as a human being. You never saw me as a daughter or a sister. I was merely a baseline. And tonight, the exact moment you discovered my financial status, I instantly morphed from a family disappointment into a newly discovered, highly lucrative resource. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Wesley to shrink back toward the table. "Do not stand here and insult my intelligence by playing the role of a wounded, desperate family," I commanded, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "Less than 1 hour ago, in this exact room, you sat in those chairs and relentlessly butchered my character. You explicitly called me a useless freeloader. You called me an ungrateful burden. You openly mocked my clothing, my career, and my vehicle. You stated, with absolute conviction, that I possessed absolutely no concept of value or the future. You confidently declared that I lacked the basic funds to call a decent ride home. You attempted to steal my inheritance and casually intended to throw me onto the street to finance a fraudulent lifestyle. So do not dare weaponize the concept of family to save yourselves from the fire you actively built." My father's face flushed a deep, shameful red. He recognized that logical reasoning and bargaining were entirely useless against me. In a final, desperate act of emotional warfare, he tried to hurl one last spear of guilt. "If you walk out that door and let your brother face complete financial and legal ruin," my father warned, his voice shaking with venomous spite, "you will carry that horrible stain forever. You will be known for the rest of your natural life as the cold, heartless woman who deliberately destroyed her own family. You will have to look in the mirror every single morning and know you tore us apart when you easily had the power to save us." I did not flinch. His words, which would have emotionally devastated me a decade ago, simply bounced off the impenetrable armor I had spent years meticulously building. "I am not destroying this family," I replied, my voice steady, unbothered, and brutally honest. "This family destroyed itself years ago through an endless cycle of greed, toxic favoritism, and profound delusion. The foundation has been completely rotten for decades. All I did tonight was finally turn on the lights so you could all clearly see the wreckage." I turned slightly, yielding the floor to the man who represented my absolute authority. Adrian stepped forward, his posture impeccable, his expression an emotionless mask of legal precision. He looked at the 4 shattered people standing around the dining table. "My client is no longer entertaining negotiations or emotional appeals," Adrian stated, his baritone voice finalizing the reality of the room. "You currently possess exactly 2 options. Option 1. You immediately sign a legally binding declaration permanently renouncing any and all administrative, residual, or financial claims to the Old City property. Furthermore, you will fully cooperate with Northren Risk and Recovery in restructuring the secondary debt you fraudulently acquired. We will establish a strict, heavily monitored repayment plan for the exact principal amount, but you will permanently surrender all control." Adrian paused, letting the weight of the first choice settle before delivering the alternative. "Option 2, he continued. "You refuse to sign. If you choose this path, at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, my legal team will initiate a massive, coordinated barrage of civil litigation. We will file formal charges for preliminary mortgage fraud, unauthorized use of estate credentials, and gross fiduciary negligence. We will actively engage the State Commercial Regulatory Board to expand the investigation into Blue Harbor route systems, which will inevitably lead to total asset seizure and potential criminal liability for all involved parties." The silence that followed was heavy, thick, and suffocating. It was the undeniable sound of total, unconditional surrender. The air in the dining room was dense with a dark, inescapable humiliation. My father looked at the documents. My mother wept silently into her hands. Wesley stared blankly at the floor, his entire fabricated universe completely dissolved. Savannah stood frozen, realizing her days of luxury were permanently terminated. For the very first time in their entire lives, the fundamental hierarchy of the Rice family had been violently inverted. They finally understood, with bone-chilling clarity, that the person holding absolute, unchallenged power over their existence tonight was not the arrogant patriarch, and it was certainly not the golden child. It was the quiet, unassuming daughter they had spent a lifetime trying to erase. The silence that hung in the dining room was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a tangible, suffocating weight pressing down on the chests of the four people who had assumed they could easily dictate my future. I looked at the array of legal documents spread across the mahogany table, the stark black ink outlining the absolute termination of their financial fantasies. Let me be entirely unequivocally clear so there is absolutely no room for misinterpretation, I began, my voice steady and completely drained of any lingering familial warmth. I am not going to save Blue Harbor root systems. I will not pay off a single one of your outstanding commercial debts. I will not act as a guarantor for any future loans. I will not lend you a single dollar from my personal accounts or my corporate funds. I will not attach my name, my firm, or my credit to any of your endeavors. Wesley's logistics company is going to fail, and he is going to have to navigate the bankruptcy proceedings entirely on his own. Wesley let out a strangled, pathetic noise, sinking lower into his chair, but I did not afford him a second glance. I turned my attention back to the man sitting at the head of the table. However, I continued, gesturing to Adrian. My counsel stepped forward and placed one final slender document directly in front of my father. I have exactly zero interest in leaving any administrative loose ends regarding my grandmother's estate. I want absolute, permanent closure tonight. This document is a formal binding buyout agreement. It legally severs the vague, residual executor privileges you have been weaponizing against me. My father stared at the paper as if it were a live serpent. His eyes darted across the introductory paragraphs, his jaw slackening as he reached the financial terms. You will notice the final compensation figure is remarkably low, I stated, maintaining eye contact as he realized the full extent of his defeat. That is because my firm calculated the exact market value of your residual administrative claim and immediately subtracted the massive, high-interest mezzanine debt you fraudulently secured against the property. We also deducted the standard legal fees required to untangle the bureaucratic mess you created. After all of those liabilities are formally subtracted, the remaining buyout price is exactly $1,000. My father was visibly stunned. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking frail and ancient. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and lingering, desperate pride. $1,000? You are buying out my remaining rights to a prime piece of real estate in the city for $1,000? That is an absolute insult. I will not sign this. I refuse to be robbed in my own home. You do not have a single ounce of bargaining power left, I reminded him, my tone as cold and hard as polished marble. If you refuse to sign that specific agreement tonight, the buyout offer is permanently revoked. Tomorrow morning, my legal team will initiate the foreclosure proceedings on the secondary debt you owe us. You will lose the administrative rights anyway, but you will also be dragged into a horrific, extremely public civil litigation battle that will likely result in the seizure of this suburban house and the complete liquidation of your retirement portfolios. You are not being robbed. You are being handed the only viable exit strategy you have left. This is revenge! Wesley suddenly shrieked, slamming his fists violently against the table. He leaped to his feet, his face twisted in an ugly red mask of pure fury. You planned this entire thing. You sat there in your city house and plotted to destroy us just because Mom and Dad loved me more. You are a vindictive, psychotic monster taking revenge on your own flesh and blood. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his chaotic, unhinged energy. I simply looked at my younger brother, a 30-year-old man throwing a desperate tantrum because his safety net had finally been cut. This is absolutely not revenge, Wesley, I said calmly, the absolute truth of my words cutting through his hysterics. Revenge would be me actively ruining a successful business. Revenge would be me creating a problem you did not deserve. I did none of those things. Your company failed because you are profoundly incompetent. Our father is in debt because he committed financial fraud. All I did tonight was build a wall high enough so that your massive failures could no longer spill over and drown me. This is not revenge. This is me permanently reclaiming absolute control over my own life. My mother, who had been weeping silently into her hands, suddenly reached out and grabbed the heavy silver fountain pen. Her hands were shaking violently, the tears dropping onto the polished wood of the table. She did not bother reading the clauses or debating the terms. She simply understood that the war was over and they had suffered a catastrophic loss. She signed her name on the witness line, her handwriting jagged and uneven. She pushed the document toward her husband, unable to look him in the eye. My father stared at the pen. For his entire adult life, he had viewed himself as the untouchable, authoritative head of the Rice family. He had demanded respect, dictated terms, and controlled the narrative. Picking up that pen meant voluntarily surrendering that delusion forever. His hand trembled severely as he reached for the silver barrel. He hesitated for 10 agonizing seconds, the silence stretching tightly across the room. Then, with a slow, defeated exhalation, he pressed the gold nib to the paper. I watched him sign his name. With every single stroke of the pen, he was actively tearing down the false image of the powerful patriarch he had clung to for decades. When he finally crossed the last letter, he dropped the pen as if it had burned his fingers. "There is one final condition heavily embedded in those pages," I instructed as Adrian efficiently collected the signed contracts and slid them safely into his leather briefcase. I mandated the inclusion of a comprehensive, legally binding non-harassment and no-contact clause. Effective immediately. You are completely barred from contacting me. You will not call my personal phone. You will not send emails. You will absolutely not show up at my private residence in the city, nor will you ever approach my corporate offices. You will not utilize extended family members or mutual acquaintances as intermediaries to beg for money or demand a reconciliation. If any of you violate this boundary, my firm will execute severe legal penalties without a single moment of hesitation." Wesley let out a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated frustration. He lunged forward, intending to grab the documents back from Adrian, to tear them up, to do absolutely anything to reverse the crushing reality of the night. But he did not make it past his own chair. Savannah, who had remained terrifyingly silent since realizing her luxurious lifestyle was permanently dead, suddenly reached out and grabbed him by the back of his tailored suit jacket. She yanked him backward with surprising force, her manicured nails digging deep into the expensive fabric. "Stop it!" Savannah hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Just stop embarrassing yourself. Wesley, look around. It is completely over. Every single door is closed. She holds all the cards, and we have absolutely nothing left. Sit down and shut your mouth before you make it even worse for us." Wesley froze, staring at his wife in absolute shock. The realization that even his most devoted enabler had abandoned his fantasy finally broke him completely. He slumped back into his chair, dropping his head onto the table, utterly defeated. I stood up slowly from my seat. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I looked around the formal dining room, taking in the heavy mahogany furniture, the crystal chandelier, the expensive drapes. For over 3 decades, this exact room had been a psychological prison. It was the place where I had been systematically made to feel small, insignificant, and fundamentally unworthy of love or respect. But as I stood there tonight, looking at the 4 broken people sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance, I realized a profound truth. I did not feel any lingering resentment. I did not feel the heavy, suffocating pain that had haunted my childhood. I felt completely, wonderfully empty. The emotional chains they had wrapped around my neck had simply dissolved into nothing. Adrian stood by my side, his briefcase securely locked, radiating an aura of absolute professional finality. I smoothed the front of my sweater and looked at my family one last time. "My grandmother left me the house," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent room, ensuring they would remember these final words for the rest of their lives. But tonight, I took back so much more than that. I took back my name. I took back my absolute peace of mind. And most importantly, I finally claimed the right to walk away and never save the people who actively refused to save me. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room. I moved through the foyer, my footsteps steady and unhurried on the hardwood floor. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the crisp, cool autumn night. The deep rumbling engine of the black BMW was already running, waiting patiently in the circular driveway. Adrian opened the rear passenger door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, the interior smelling of expensive cologne and quiet power. As the car smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the manicured suburban house far behind, I knew with absolute certainty that no one inside that house would ever dare to ask how far the woman they called a freeloader had gone before they even realized she had left them entirely behind. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and please let me know down in the comments where in the world you are tuning in from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Daisy Revenge Stories channel, leave a like on the video, and support me even more by pressing the hype button so that this story can reach and be heard by many more people.